everybody. Joining us today on the podcast, we have Nick Agar-Johnson. Nick is the editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, also serves as a writer for Hashtag Basketball and Nets Republic. Nick also hosts his own podcast with Hashtag Basketball called NBA Deep Dives Podcast. Nick, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I know we're going to get into some summer league conversation, which it's an experience in and of itself. And I'm really excited to get to relive some of those memories and chop it up with some basketball stuff with the two of you.
Yeah, now you guys, it was tough to nail some of you No Ceilings guys down. I was reaching out to you guys during draft and a little bit afterwards. And for summer league, got a hold of Corey, was in and out with him for a little bit, then didn't hear back from him. Got Alex on, got a hold of him finally. He's been busy. I think he had some housework or something going on. And then he recommended I reach out to you. So I thank you for, giving me your time and joining us today. So also joining us today, we have co-host Steve Celadon, our lead NBA analyst here at Just a Bit Inside podcast, joining us on the on this conversation. So Nick, like I was saying, you had your first experience heading to the NBA Summer League this year. How was that?
So NBA Summer League in Las Vegas is a unique experience in sports. I had some idea of what it was like just from having talked to some people who'd been there previously, but it's one thing to sort of have a vague conception of what it's like from, having seen it on TV or having heard from people who've actually been there. And it's entirely different to be just walking in the middle of these two gyms in Las Vegas, and every once in a while you see someone walk by who's 7 feet tall, and it's like, oh, I wonder if that person is associated with the NBA in any way. And it's this really crazy experience of incredibly condensed amount of sports from some of the best up and coming young players in the NBA, while also sort of feeling for a little bit like you're sort of in the center of the NBA world for however long you're there in Las Vegas. So it's a unique experience for sure. And I think I had some idea of what it would be like heading in, but it's one thing to have that sort of conception of what the experience is like, and entirely different to actually show up and, watch basically 3-4 days of nothing but basketball in one of the craziest arena environments that I've ever been in. So really cool experience.
Yeah, now I know they have it at a few different destinations, but I think Vegas has always kind of been that key spot for Summer League. What's what was the crowd like there? Is it just fans from different teams? And then what were some of the things that surprised you while you were there that you maybe didn't expect to see?
Sure. So in terms of the experience, so there's two sort of arenas that are in the same complex. There's the Thomas and Mack Center, which is basically the UNLV stadium. So it looks like you'd expect from a D1 basketball stadium. I want to say 15,000-ish seating capacity, just off the top of my head. And for the biggest game that I was there for, which was the Thunder Rockets game that was sort of late in the day, that basically the entire arena was full for that game. And, it was a pretty raucous experience. Crowd was definitely getting into it. And then most of the rest of the time that I was there, it was about half full arena, give or take. But, the fans of the teams that were actually playing were some of the most excited fans you're going to see, kids screaming for, whoever it was. There was a couple sections of kids who were a few seats over from us at one point. They were just screaming overrated at basically every single player that walked onto the court, which, not that far different from a lot of basketball experiences. But Cox Pavilion, which is the second arena there, that one, you're basically like right up on the floor. Like, there's basically bleacher style seating. It kind of feels like a high school gym, honestly, but, you're watching some of the best NBA players or future NBA players in some cases, playing in basically this high school gym where you're right there. You can hear the players talking on the floor. You can, see the guys on the benches pretty clearly. So it's very interesting in that, they're basically joined, so you can just walk from one stadium to the other. So, multiple times throughout the summer league experience, we'd say, okay, third quarter of this game, it's going to be kind of a blowout. Let's wander on over to the other gym and see what's happening. So that's, I think, the coolest part of the Vegas experience is you have these two very different environments for watching basketball. And you literally can just, because it's general admission seating for both places, you just, okay, this game isn't as fun, so get up, walk on over to the other gym and see some more basketball.
Nice. That's awesome. So now, aside from the experiences you saw, let's talk about some of the, performances you saw. So, you're based in Sacramento. We'll kind of get to Keegan Murray, who I think, was probably the standout player from Summer League. Who are some other players you thought that had, standout performances or maybe, exceeded expectations?
So yes, Keegan Murray, I certainly will be excited to talk about when we get to him. But I think the biggest player that stood out, both literally and figuratively, was Paulo Banchero. The thing with Paulo is, number one overall pick. Obviously, you're expecting him to kind of dominate the proceedings, but you show up in the arena and he just looks massive. I mean, he's listed at 6'10". I would not be surprised if he's like, 6'10" and a half in shoes, probably, more like 7 feet when he's actually out on the court. And, 250 pounds, he is built, he looks like someone who's been in the NBA for 5 years already. And, when he was out there on the court, it was very easy to just watch this nearly 7-footer bring the ball up on basically every play, just absolutely take over the flow of the game for the Orlando Magic every time he was in there, getting into his mid-range shots with ease, getting to the rim pretty effectively, and making some really top level highlight reel passes. So he was someone who, again, you kind of expect the number one overall pick to show up and play good basketball, but particularly seeing him in person. I hadn't had the chance to see him in person before this summer league. So yeah, actually getting to see him live, he was someone who just immediately stood out as incredibly impressive.
Yeah. Now, kind of going back to the draft, were you surprised when you heard Woj drop the bomb that he was going to go number one overall when kind of people are expecting Jabari to go one?
So short answer is yes. The long answer is we were doing a No Ceilings NBA draft live stream on the actual day of the draft. And basically what we had been hearing was, 24 hours before the actual draft, all of the lines in Las Vegas started shifting dramatically for who's going to be the number one overall pick. It had been so clearly Jabari Smith Jr. throughout the entire process. And then all of a sudden, the day before, all these lines in Las Vegas start moving. And, some of the guys on the team are basically like, is this real? Can we expect that Paulo might actually be the number one overall pick? And then of course we get to draft night. And even in the moments like leading up to the pick being announced, my thought internally was, okay, so probably Jabari, but is that Paulo knew something? Is that Paulo knew something? And then, when he actually was announced as the number one overall pick, I had turned Woj notifications off for the purpose of the live stream, so I wasn't getting the picks spoiled like right before I had to talk about them. But so it was a genuine surprise when Paulo went as the number one overall pick. And, it's not even hindsight from that far at this point. It hasn't even been a month yet since the draft. And, Summer League has been incredibly exciting. It was a wonderful experience, but, also not something I want to try and draw too many strong takeaways from. But watching Paulo and Jabari Smith Jr. play in Vegas for Summer League, it made a lot of sense in some ways why Orlando said, you know what, we're just going to go with the guy who has the best chance to be a superstar and the best chance to be a primary scoring option and someone who can also, be a primary playmaker for us, rather than someone like Jabari Smith Jr., who I think, especially early on in his NBA career, is going to have a lot more of a complementary kind of skill set.
Okay. Yeah, that makes definitely a lot of sense there. Now, who were some guys you thought maybe underwhelmed that you saw during Summer League?
Yeah. So remember how I just mentioned Jabari Smith Jr.?
Yeah, I was trying to not lead to that, but let's hit on it.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Jabari Smith Jr., first of all, his defense was, as advertised, namely extremely impressive. He's someone who has all the ability you could want out of a four who could cover potentially multiple positions. But the problem with Jabari Smith is that his biggest weakness at the moment is his scoring, his ability to create shots for himself with the ball in his hands. His handle was something that I think was brought up time and time again throughout the draft evaluation process. And with him in Summer League, there were multiple times where he was just trying to get into his shot and was clearly getting frustrated by the fact that he just wasn't able to knock anything down. His shots weren't falling. And given that he doesn't have the same sort of thing as Paulo or even Chet Holmgren, honestly, who, both of those guys can do a little bit with the ball in their hands. They can, play make a bit. They can keep the ball moving. They can be effective when their shots aren't falling. With Jabari, it was more like, the defense was exactly what I've wanted to see from him, but the inconsistency with his shooting and the fact that he just had a couple of really bad shooting nights in Vegas, I'm not discouraged by Jabari at all in the longer term, but certainly, in comparison to the other guy who was considered likely to go number one overall, Paulo really dominated in that summer league kind of environment, which is not exactly as tailor-made to Jabari Smith's skill set. And so, again, I'm not worried about him in the longer term, but certainly he's someone who he could have really shut up a lot of doubters if he had a spectacular summer league performance, and he just did not.
Nick, I think you're exactly right. If I could just cut in, you see Paulo all the time on Instagram or on Slam. He's always playing pickup games with NBA players. I think that kind of like LaMelo Ball coming out of high school and then overseas, I always thought he was like a good player. And then you put him with professional players and he just seems that much better. Where Jabari Smith just doesn't seem like he's got the confidence yet. I think part of the reason why the Magic drafted Paulo was because he was more NBA ready to compete. But do you also worry about the team that Jabari Smith is getting drafted to that has, as we saw, Josh Christopher wanted the ball. It was clear that he wanted to be the offensive guy. Kevin Porter, who's got, he pulled himself up by his bootstraps out of Cleveland. Jalen Green wants to be the star. Kenyon Martin's already asking for trades. Do you worry about Jabari Smith's fit and transitioning into that young core and getting the touches that we think he deserves?
It's funny. I'm not as worried precisely because of that surrounding context, I guess what I mean by that is that, with Jalen Green and Josh Christopher and Kevin Porter handling the ball a lot for Houston, the fact that Jabari isn't someone who you're going to ask to create as much right away, I think that's going to actually be pretty solid for his earlier career development, because basically all he's going to need to do is, okay, you're going to be the defense for us, right? Like all of those guys, with the exception of Josh Christopher, who's had some solid moments on the defensive end. But for the most part, those are not guys that you're looking to for defensive prowess, right? Yeah. So with Jabari, I think that it's actually a pretty solid fit for him, because right away he can come in, he can be the floor spacer, he can be the third option on offense. And, if his handle never really comes around, okay, the main thing with him for Houston is as long as he can space the floor and be an exceptional defensive player, then I think that's the kind of profile that he has. And I think those skills will be emphasized early on in Houston. Now, again, the flip side is, will he really develop the handle that he needs if he's never getting the opportunities with the ball in his hands? And that's, I think, a slightly different kind of dilemma for him. But I think in terms of the fit early on, it makes a lot of sense to say, focus most of your energy on the defensive end. And then on the offensive end, he was one of the best shooters in the draft. And, being a 6'10" shooter with his kind of mobility on the defensive end, I think Houston can afford to say, you know what, you're going to be a complementary player on offense early on. And if you figure out more with the ball in your hands, great, but that's not necessarily what we need you to do.
Right. Yeah. Be a floor spacer, be a dangerous 3-shot, guard the other team's best player. I'm worried about it in the West in such a dangerous division too, of putting such a load on a rookie to be the stopper,
Yeah. I mean, that's totally fair, but I guess, the flip side of that is you're not putting as much pressure on him on the offensive end, right? Whereas with Orlando, it's like, okay, Paulo, we're expecting you to be the engine of our offense from day one, right? We're expecting you to be the superstar scorer, but also the distributor, because our point guards aren't really past first point guards. So, when you're talking about Cole Anthony and Markelle Fultz, those aren't exactly guys who you expect to be the, pure playmaker type. So having someone like Paulo who can add playmaking juice is helpful for them. But, the flip side is he's going to have a lot of the offense on his shoulders, especially if Jalen Suggs, who's someone who I still really believe in, but his first year in the league, he was much more of a defense first player than an offense first player. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Paulo in Orlando to score the ball and get the ball to his teammates in good spots. So I don't know. It is kind of interesting in that they, are going to, I think, have two very different situations heading in, but both of those situations can sort of maximize what they showed they were best at during their years in college.
Definitely. Now, moving on to one guy that we thought maybe be a little bit worried about. What do you think of Shaedon Sharpe? And, he barely appeared this year in summer league. He wasn't much in, at last year in college. What do you think Blazers fans should be thinking about him right now?
He is a mystery, and he was a mystery heading into the draft, and he's still a mystery now. I mean, he had a shoulder injury after the first 5 minutes of summer league, and we saw like 3 possessions from him, basically. One where he threw a crazy alley-oop into like the 12th row that nobody got anywhere near touching. One where he made a really nice step back jumper, and then one where he got absolutely roasted on defense. And that was basically it for his entire summer league showing. So the only honest answer I can give you is I'm just as confused by Shaden Sharp as I was heading into the process. And, from the Portland fans' perspective, I think the fact that their summer league team actually won the summer league title without Shaden Sharp, again, trying to draw too much from summer league is a bit of a dangerous proposition. But I mean, the fact that Trendon Watford and the rest of that Portland squad was as solid as they were in Vegas is certainly a positive sign for Trailblazers fans. But I mean, Shaden Sharp played, I don't remember if it was 3 minutes or 5 minutes total, but not many minutes, single digit minutes before he got hurt. Okay. Yeah, 5 minutes, single digit minutes before he got hurt. And then that was kind of it for him. So he's about as much of a mystery in my mind as he was going in. And, he has the potential to be someone who we look back on this draft class in 10 years and say, man, how did he end up going 7th? And he could also be someone that we look back on in 10 years and say, how did he end up going all the way up to 7th?
Yeah.
Like that's the thing with him. He's just such a mystery even still. And, the flashes were encouraging, but we only got a few minutes worth of them.
Now, Nick, let me let you gush a little bit. So Keegan Murray, of course, was selected Summer League MVP. What stood out about his performance, and how do you think he's going to, drive this Kings team this year?
So Keegan Murray was incredibly interesting to watch at Summer League. I'd like to think that even from a non-Kings fan perspective, non-Sacramento, the non-person living in Sacramento perspective, that it was still very interesting. But he had a couple of very quiet first quarters to the point where, I'd say, oh, Keegan's not doing not all that much out there, fading into the woodwork a little bit. And then you look up at the end of the second quarter, he's got 10 points and 3 assists. And he has this way that's, very interesting of just quietly continuing to produce possession after possession, play after play. And, you get to the end of the game, it's like, wow, he has 20 points again. It's like those moments where, halfway through the third quarter, it's like, okay, he's having a bit of a disappointing game. He hasn't really showed up to the level you'd want him to. And then hits a couple threes on back-to-back possessions, gets a strip, gets a rebound in traffic, hits the ball ahead to one of his teammates. And all of a sudden you look up and it's like, he's had a really impressive game. And, I'm not doing the kind of sell job that I should for the Summer League MVP, especially given that he's the Kings Summer League MVP. But I think that was the most fascinating part of his Summer League effort to me, was that, when he had his big moments, like when he hit a 3-pointer to tie the game against the Orlando Magic, which, says a lot about being a Kings fan, but also one of the best Kings fan moments I've had in person watching the team. But hey, you take what you can get. But, the thing with Keegan too, is like, he had that big moment, he had a couple of, statement punctuation mark threes, throughout his Summer League tenure, but there were also periods where it'd be like, he's just been quietly one of the most productive players on the court. And in a way that I think is really encouraging for his ability to, go into the Sacramento context with Domantas Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox kind of being the lead guys up front, and, saying, hey, Keegan, be the third scorer, right? Be the guy who, gets to the end of the third quarter. It's like, how does he have 14 points? Right. And, be the guy who's I think he's going to be an above average defender at the NBA level sooner rather than later. And I think that whether the Kings trade Harrison Barnes or not, I think the two of them work really well together as a forward combo, especially with De'Aaron Fox at point and Domantas Sabonis manning the middle. So, in terms of excitement for Keegan, I mean, when he got hot and when he got on a run, it was really fun to watch. But, even when he was just sort of quietly, plodding along, as it were, he was still really, really productive in a way that, maybe doesn't jump out as much as the Paulo Banchero 360 dunk, but, certainly shows up on the stat sheet.
Mm-hmm. It's weird. It's weird giving, and I don't mean any disrespect by it, but it's weird giving the Kings so much credit for actually nailing this pick. I know there was so much pressure on taking Jaden Ivey, and I'm a Knicks fan, by the way. We haven't gotten anything right, but I know the pressure was to take Ivey, but to take Keegan, and like you said, he's so efficient on the court, and he's actually going into a good spot where they're just asking him to do what he does best. We talked about the pressures or lack thereof of Jabari Smith. There's really no pressure for Keegan Murray. He didn't go top 3. He's on an underperforming team habitually. They've got Sabonis, they've got Fox as the 2 stars on the team, and they're asking him just to get a bucket when he can. Like, I think that's almost like the ideal situation for a rookie, especially a scoring rookie, to go into. Nick, to kind of snowball into my question here, you look at Jaden Ivey, Keegan Murray, you look at even Johnny Davis, even though he had a up and down summer league. Do you miss the era of when these players stayed more than 1 year in college? I understand that the draw to Chet, to Paolo, to Jabari, you're banking on talent, you're banking on the right now, you're banking on your team's needs. But you look at the 3 guys I mentioned prior, and the jumps that they took from freshman to sophomore year are astronomical, and now it's paying off. They have a little more confidence, a little more swag on the court. Johnny Davis, I thought, is a leader. I thought he was a little too passive in summer league, but a team guy. Jaden Ivey carries himself. He's big with such confidence. And Keegan, like you said, the MVP of the summer league.
So, yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Johnny Davis, because him being tentative was one of the things that was the most surprising to me about summer league. I would have expected him to be a lot less hesitant. But on the going back to school point, it's very interesting because I think with Keegan Murray and Jaden Ivey, you saw basically the best case scenario for that, right?
Yeah.
It's like both of those guys, with Murray, he's someone who maybe would have been like a 2nd round pick last year, but probably not. I mean, he was basically on the bench at Iowa, not doing all that much. He wasn't someone who was on my radar even for the 2021 draft. With Jaden Ivey, he was someone who I believed in for that draft, but, believing in him for that draft was like, I thought some teams should take a chance on him as, end of the 1st round, right? I think that he's getting more, I think his shot is much further along than people give it credit for. This is me evaluating last year. I mean, I'd still say that about Ivy, but, the idea being that he's someone who probably would have been end of the 1st round. And then the guy that went right behind Murray and Ivy as well, Benedict Mathurin, someone who probably would have been an end of the 1st round pick if he'd, declared out of Arizona. And instead they go back for another year and they play a much bigger role in the offense. And, with Murray in particular, I mean, his shooting took a massive leap from his, 1st year at Iowa to this past season. And, all of a sudden these guys are going 4, 5, 6 in the draft. But, the flip side of that is something like the Alex Poythress story where, he came into Kentucky as like a highly touted recruit, someone who almost certainly would have gone in the 1st round if he declared after a pretty disappointing freshman season. He said, no, you know what, I'm going to come back to school, prove myself and, get drafted higher in the 1st round next year. And just the same story year after year of, not quite, exploding in the way that he would have wanted. And, suddenly he gets to the end of his 4 years and he isn't that 1st round pick, right? So I think it's a very interesting dilemma. I think it works out very well for some people. I mean, with Murray, Ivy, Benedict Mathurin, Johnny Davis, clearly, worked out very well for them to go back to school for their sophomore season. The flip side, the other, I think, angle that you could take on this is someone like Dalen Terry, who, I mean, he was a sophomore, right? He wasn't, someone who was just coming out after his 1st year of school and any of that. But I mean, he ended up going 18th overall. And a lot of that was because his last month and a half of the season at Arizona was incredibly impressive. And some seen the Chicago Bulls in this particular case, but, the chatter was like, okay, if he goes back to school and Benedict Mathurin's gone to the league, so he's going to get a lot more touches and he continues to impress like he has, all of a sudden he's going to end up going in the top 10. Why don't we take him now when we can get him at 18? So I think it's, it's an interesting dilemma that I think is a very different evaluation for each different prospect, but certainly, with the 4, 5, 6 guys in this particular draft, clearly was a huge benefit to them to, as you said, go back to school and get that increased confidence from, playing at a much higher level than you had your 1st season in school.
Yeah, maybe it's just selfishness of being a college basketball guy, but
sure.
I mean, like, we're actually going to touch on him pretty soon, which I'm super excited about, but it was just the Quentin Grimes factor of being a top recruit to Kansas, not panning out, and then going to Houston and then destroying my Syracuse Orange in the national tournament. But I think we've got him on deck to talk about. Okay.
Yeah, we'll get into the Knicks stuff. Steve will be very passionate once we get to Quentin Grimes. I'm sure it will snowball from there. I expect. But going back to a little bit of the summer league, Nick, I was surprised to see Josh Giddey out there for the Thunder team. So you kind of got to see a little bit of a preview of him and Chet together. You know, of course, you got SGA in the mix too. You know, what are your thoughts on, you know, Chet's performance and the core that the Thunder are building?
So to start off, I was also shocked that Josh Giddey played in Summer League, and he barely looked to score at all, and he was still one of the most impressive players out there. And, you know, there are a few guys every year. Yeah, this year it was Moses Moody, it was Quentin Grimes, and it was Josh Giddey for me, the guys who's like, wait, why are they playing in Summer League? And they very quickly proved, actually, they probably shouldn't be playing in Summer League. There's no real need to play in the Summer League. For the Chet side of it, I think he did basically exactly what I would have hoped for him to do for the Thunder, which was he wasn't, you know, the 25 point a game, Paulo, Keegan Murray type scorer, but he just filled a ton of gaps for them. You know, he had a ton of games where he had like 12 to 15 points, 7 to 10 rebounds, you know, 2-3 blocks, 2-3 assists, 2-3 steals kind of thing, where he's like filling in gaps for them on the defensive end, you know, being someone who can rove, be a mobile big man, but also one of the best rim protecting talents in the draft in a number of years. And on the offensive end, you know, someone who, there was one play where the Thunder ran out. It was Josh Giddey, Ousmane Dieng, Jalen Williams, Chet Holmgren, and Aaron Wiggins. And it was basically just 5 guys who can all bring the ball up the floor, who can all play make a little bit. And I turned to one of my colleagues and was like, imagine this lineup when you're replacing Aaron Wiggins with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, right? It's like the smallest guy on the court is 6'6", and, you know, all of the guys other than the 6'6" guy can switch across positions defensively, can bring the ball up on rebounds, can, you know, create transition opportunities. All of them can shoot a little bit. That Thunder team is just going to be fascinating to watch, you know, especially 2-3 years from now, when I think they're going to be really dangerous. But even as soon as this coming season, they're going to be one of the most fascinating teams to watch in the NBA. And I think a huge part of that for them is, you know, Chet really fills a lot of gaps for them. You know, their defense was certainly not their strong point, and I don't think will be their strong point anytime soon. But, you know, similarly to Jabari, they can bring him out on the floor and be confident that he is going to make their defense better, which is not something that you can say about most rookies in the NBA in any sort of context. And the fact that, you know, he can also provide what he provides on offense as someone who can handle the ball a bit, someone who can shoot, someone who can make the right reads as a passer. He just fills in a lot of holes for this Thunder team that I think allows the rest of their roster to be the best that they can be as well. You know, I'm sure that Shai will be very happy to have someone like Chet, you know, cleaning up defensive mistakes behind him while also being someone he can kick out to for threes, or, you know, even throw lobs to on the baseline every once in a while.
Nick, you kind of answered my question, and then I kind of double questioned my theory. Almost to the point where I'm such a Thunder believer as well with Giddey, Shai, Chet. But part of me feels like they're actually too competitive for what I thought their timeline should be. They've already extended out Shai. They gave Dort $86 million, which I dropped my phone when I saw. Now they're drafting such a presence in Chet. I believe that he could bring a defensive impact out of Evan Mobley on the Cavaliers. Do you almost think that they're going to be too competitive in this season? Not win the championship, obviously, or even make the playoffs. But for the longest time, I thought Presti was accumulating picks to go for the next draft, in that of Victor Wembanyama at number 1 and so on and so forth. Or is it just crazy thinking that this team is going to be as good as I thought they would be?
I mean, this is the team that shut down Al Horford for 2 months. And basically anytime it gets to February, you know, all of a sudden guys have these terrible nagging injuries that, just so rough. They can't be out there on the court. But, you know, I'm sure that come around April 15th, when there's off-season workouts, all of a sudden those injuries are just going to magically be so much better. And they're going to, you know, love playing basketball again, love seeing them out there on the court. So I mean, that's the cynical, snarky answer. The true, slightly less cynical, slightly less snarky answer is, I think they're going to be much. I mean, I don't think it's much of a stretch to say they're going to be much better next year than they were this past year, but I don't think they're quite going to be like a playoff team yet. And, I think given what the Spurs have done over the past few weeks, really, given what Utah's done over the past few weeks, really, given that I think Houston is probably going to be a level below the Thunder next season, I think the Thunder pieces fit together a lot better than the Rockets pieces, even though I think Jabari Smith Jr. fits pretty well for Houston. I think that the Thunder are still probably going to be one of those teams in the 11 through 13-ish seed range in the seed range in the West. I think they're probably going to be on the outside looking in, even from a play-in perspective. And at that point, I mean, the odds of the, seventh best odds versus the best odds for the number one pick, like your odds of being in the top 5 are much lower if you have seventh, but the odds of getting the number one overall pick aren't that dramatically different. So I expect that the Thunder are going to be happy to be like the 5th worst team in the NBA next season. And, if there's any injury concerns for any of their guys at all, then all of a sudden we're going to be sitting on the bench for a couple months. That's just going to be what that is. But I think it's a fair point, because I think it definitely seemed like, and certainly seems like from what the Spurs have done the past few weeks, that a whole lot of NBA teams are targeting the 2023 draft as a really big draft class. And, there's Victor Wembanyama at the top. Obviously, there's Scoot Henderson, there's the Thompson twins, there's Nick Smith Jr., who I really believe in, Cam Whitmore, Derek Whitehead. I can just read off prospects who almost certainly would have been considered in the top 3 for this draft, all the way down to like 7 or 8 or so in that draft range. So, I mean, I don't think the Thunder are going to have a problem with being good, in a theoretical context, but it is interesting. And I think that's a very good point that you're making, that, maybe they're going to be a little better a little sooner than they would have wanted to be. But I don't think it's going to be the kind of thing like we saw with Cleveland, where, they were the 1 seed in the East for some time last season. And, they fell apart down the stretch because of injuries, but they were still a team that was clearly dramatically elevated from where they'd been the year before. I don't quite see that happening with this Thunder squad, but I mean, I certainly think they're going to be a lot better than they were last year, and certainly a lot better, a lot sooner than maybe people would have anticipated.
All right, cool. Nick, kind of segueing to a different topic now. Last year, Jalen Smith and Luka Garza made all summer league teams. Am I getting too excited over Quentin Grimes being on the all summer league team? Do you hold any stock in these teams at all? In fact, I know Benedict Mathurin, as we mentioned earlier, only played 3 games, but in those 3 games, he almost shot 50 and 40%, which I couldn't believe. He looked like an absolute gunner, and I'm sure they shut him down because, we get it. We don't want him to have a bad game, lose confidence, get hurt, God forbid. But when you look at all summer league teams, is it really just like a very good participation trophy?
So first of all, I do want to say that this is the kind of environment where feel free to get excited about Quentin Grimes. I thought he was awesome in summer league, and yeah, I'm sure that's what you wanted to hear. Yeah. No, but it's funny because, sometimes you look back at these all summer league teams and it's like a pretty good sign for which rookies were readier to go than other rookies. Like, in some cases, like for Paulo, what I saw from him in summer league, do I expect him to be scoring 25 points a game and throwing down 360 dunks in NBA competition? No, I don't particularly, but the fact that he was as impressive as he was in the kind of context that he was that impressive in is, I think, an encouraging sign for his first season in the NBA. Similarly with Benedict Mathurin, I mean, the first game I saw him against the Hornets, he put in like 23 points in 20 minutes or 19 minutes actually. And it was like, he looks really, really impressive out there. And then other times you get like Josh Selby, who was the summer league MVP and never really quite panned out in the NBA. So I think for summer league, in terms of what I try and take away from it, which I think I'm having stronger takes just because I was there in person this time when I hadn't been before. But, I think really it's if, top flight guys really, really perform, like, recently drafted top 10 rookies, or guys like Quentin Grimes, who are second year players who, had some real moments and then come to the summer league environment and they look a level above, the guys that they're playing against. I think in those kind of cases, I think it's very indicative. I think the flip side is, Johnny Davis was playing very hesitantly, but his defense looked fine, and his surrounding summer league context, that was not a good Washington Wizards squad around him. And, he'll have more talent around him at the NBA level. So, maybe he'll be even more hesitant in an NBA environment when he's not, the top 10 guy that the team is trying to showcase at summer league. But maybe him having spacing around him like he didn't at Wisconsin, and definitely didn't with his summer league squad, he'll look much better. But, I think really it's like, for the guys who are like, the 27-year-old, like fifth year vet who, was on the end of the bench for 3 different NBA teams and all of a sudden comes into summer league and has a great performance. And like, I can't think of who that specific archetype that I'm describing would be off the top of my head, but, for that kind of player, I think it's very different versus, a second year guy who looks like he's really figured some stuff out, or the top 10 pick who goes out there and is just as impressive as they were in the college environment. I think it can be pretty indicative for those kind of players. But, if you get someone who's like an end of the bench guy, who's year 3, year 4, who's on that all summer league team, I think I'd take a lot less away from that than I would from, say, Benedict Mathurin being really, really good in 3 games.
Yeah, that's how, I mean, speaking to what you were saying, that's how I feel when I turn on like a G League game and see Jarrett Jack playing or Agar-Johnson playing. I just get sad. But again, selfishly speaking, I was listening to No Ceilings today, actually, and one of your peers made a comment that put such a smile on my face. And I believe he said that he actually believes Quentin Grimes is the most talented guard on the New York Knicks. Maybe not right this second because of Jalen Brunson, but I mean, being able to see him, and I know he was actually recruited to Kansas as a point guard and that didn't pan out, but seeing him in person, do you actually believe, and let's keep our fingers crossed that he's on the team by the time we post this podcast, but do you actually see him as part of an influential Knicks team, as a team that could make waves in the East if they just give him the opportunity?
I definitely could see him being a solid positive contributor to the Knicks, especially even before the Jalen Brunson signing. I would have said, maybe not quite primary point guard, but I mean, one of the most impressive things about him in summer league was how well he ran the offense. It wasn't just that he was, stepping into 3-pointers comfortably and locking guys down on defense, which he was, to be clear. But, the most impressive part, I think, for him in summer league, and something that I think relatedly stood out a bit for Jonathan Kuminga is, for the Warriors and the Knicks, they put the ball in those guys' hands and had them run the offense a lot more than they're ever going to get to for, the big league club in essence. But, the flip side is Quentin Grimes being able to show that, actually I can run a second side pick and roll. Actually I can, make the right reads when I get the ball tossed to me at the top of the key. That I think is really hugely indicative for how he can fit in, I think in a much smaller role than he played for the summer league team for the Knicks, but, his ability to be someone who can contribute for the Knicks, it'll be interesting to see where he slots in the rotation exactly. But I mean, I'm not sure I'd quite say best guard on the Knicks, especially with Jalen Brunson in the fold, but certainly in terms of, anything I could have wanted to see from him at summer league, especially given how impressive he was with the ball in his hands, I think it's a really encouraging sign for his fit for the Knicks, now and going forward.
Love that.
I'll take that. You can sleep well tonight now, Nick. Thank you for doing that. And now let's hit on another guy who was all summer league first team. What are your thoughts on Tari Eason? I know he's a guy that Steve liked pre-draft as well.
So he's someone who I think mixed is the most honest way for me to say it. I had him in the late teens. I think I had him at 19. So like a couple picks later than he actually ended up going. But, similar to my first thought about Paolo Banchero when I saw him out on the floor, Tari Eason just looked to be on another level athletically than everyone else he played against. And, it's one thing when you're seeing him do that, at LSU, like okay, a lot of the defensive instruction for him clearly seems to be try and make plays, try and get blocks, try and jump passing lanes, try and get steals, run out when you can. Okay, great. But, there's a difference between seeing him do that in a college environment at LSU versus seeing him in summer league still just looking athletically a level above everyone else he was playing against. I mean, it was that Thunder Rockets game actually where everybody in the building was there to see Chet versus Jabari, and the most impressive player in the first half was Tari Eason, which I wasn't someone who was down on him by any stretch, but certainly was not expecting him to be the most impressive player on the floor in the first half in a game that included the number 2 overall pick, the number 3 overall pick, the number 11 overall pick, and the number 12 overall pick, all not playing all playing in that game and not being as impressive as Tari Eason was.
Nick, do you think that he just excelled due to the unstructured chaos that is summer league? Do you think when it gets into a half court offense, we're going to see way less of Tari Eason? If we were going to see him at all, he's probably more of a G League guy.
So that's an interesting question. I think that his defensive play, he actually showed a lot more discipline than I thought he did at LSU, which, given that it was in a summer league environment, was particularly encouraging for him being able to be effective in a defensive scheme, which is basically not just, all right, Tari, we're unleashing you on the other team, go get what you can get out there. In that kind of context, he clearly does well, but I was impressed by his more disciplined moments for Houston. And the other thing is, his shot is still got a long way to go, but if he can just, there were a couple games where he went 1 for 3 from distance and, got like 10 other points, basically just garbage buckets in transition. I mean, if he does that for the Rockets every game, I don't think he's going to be in the G League for very long, if at all. I mean, they could definitely just use him as, even just as a 9th man, right? Just have him be someone who comes in like, all right, so, 2 shifts per half, basically, right? Like, 10 minutes a game, 5 minutes, end of the first, beginning of the second quarter, 5 minutes, end of the third, beginning of the fourth quarter. Go out there, run as hard as you can in transition, grab rebounds, try and make plays defensively. That I think you can do right away. The question is, does he have more of a role for that earlier on in the Houston offense and the Houston defense? And quite frankly, I would not have expected to say yes before heading into Summer League. After Summer League, I am a bit more encouraged than I was. And again, I'm not someone who was down on him, but he's already looking like someone who looks very good for a 17th pick when we would have had him going in 19, right? So, clearly already a bit of a mea culpa for me on that one, but I think that he will be ready to play earlier on than I would have expected. And especially given some of the other players who looked lost out there, many times, the fact that Tari did show that discipline on the defensive end at times, and the fact that he's just such a ridiculous athlete. I mean, again, that was the thing that stood out. He just looked physically above, like a level above most of the other people he was playing against. And, the jump from college competition to NBA Summer League competition is, there's still another jump to regular NBA level competition. But if he still looked that far ahead of everybody else in that context, I'm very encouraged for what he's going to look like in an NBA context.
Now, Nick, we talked about how you do a little coverage for the Nets. So we'll kind of step away from Summer League, get into a little NBA here to wrap things up. How do you think the KD situation is going to play out? And then if KD and Kyrie both end up staying, do you think Steve Nash survives the season?
Loaded.
Yeah. I mean, take out bits and pieces.
That's a big question.
I did have it as 2 questions, but I just figured I'd put it as, I had 2 separate questions, but I figured,
Then we'll joke, tell the team what's going to happen then.
Perfect.
You're the insider. Tell us.
Yeah. I think that even a week ago, I would have said that the odds that both of them are still in the Nets at the start of the season would be next to 0. But especially after the Rudy Gobert trade and just the rumblings that I have heard around the league, I'm not going to say I, have a source within the Nets front office, because to be entirely clear, I don't, but just basically sort of reading the tea leaves of what seems to be going around the NBA world in the last week or so, it seems less and less likely that the Nets are going to be able to find a trade partner who will give up what they would need to get, I mean, they're trading Kevin Durant with 4 years left on his contract. They would need to get a record-breaking haul in a trade. And after the DeAndre Ayton situation ended up the way it did, with him going back to the Suns, being ineligible to be traded until January 15th at this point, I mean, given the nature of Kevin Durant, the amount of time he has left on his contract, and what a trade package would need to look like, I think that he would be very, very difficult to trade in the middle of the season. But based on the trade packages that teams are able to make right now, and based on the trade haul that Utah just got for Rudy Gobert, the price is going up, right? And when you're talking about Kevin Durant with 4 years left on his deal versus, basically almost anybody else in the NBA, the difference in trade package is just going to have to be seismic. And I'm not sure you can match that at this point. And with Kyrie, I mean, if you're trading Kevin Durant, then they're probably just going to be like, okay, now we need to find something for Kyrie as well. I have a feeling the offers will not be as generous for Kyrie Irving as they would be for Kevin Durant, which, there's certainly many reasons behind that. As for the Steve Nash question, that's difficult because I thought he did a lot better his first year as coach than many people did. I mean, they had like almost 30 players that cycled through that roster at points during that first season. And, he still kept them in playoff contention. They did make it to that Eastern Conference round against the Milwaukee Bucks before they fell out. This past year was very difficult it was difficult for the Brooklyn Nets as a whole, but certainly my thought that Steve Nash, I think, looked more impressive than I would have expected as a first-year coach. He did not look as good as I would have hoped for him to look as a second-year coach. I think that whether Durant or Irving are traded or not, I think the odds of him sticking around, if they're both traded and Brooklyn just says, okay, we're going to a rebuilding situation now, maybe that increases his odds of sticking around. But if they end up holding on to Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving for the entire year and his rotations look as questionable as they did at times last season, I don't know. I think the odds of him sticking around, certainly after the end of next season, if Durant and Irving are still there, are basically zero. But I think I would have said a week ago that the odds were much better that Kevin Durant got traded than that he's still in Brooklyn. I think at this point, it's starting to look more and more like there just isn't going to be a team that gives them the kind of trade package that they would need to move off of Kevin Durant, which he continues to be Kevin Durant, right? So there better be a really good trade package out there if they're going to move him. And I'm just not sure who that team is at this point.
Isn't it tough, though? I don't know if you're a fan, Nick, or if you just cover them, but isn't it tough? Because in actuality, with Simmons, Irving, Durant, Seth Curry, Joe Harris, if he has a comeback year, Nick Claxton, who's a serviceable center, they actually on paper have a team that could compete for the number 1 seed. They have a team that, if God forbid Chris Middleton got hurt again, or the Celtics aren't what they thought they would be this time around, I feel like they're finally looking like a complete team, but it's coming at the worst time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
How to answer that. No, I mean, I think, similarly to what I was saying with, and they're extraordinarily different as players, but in a similar vein to what I was saying with Chet Holmgren, Ben Simmons fills a lot of holes for that Nets team.
Right.
He's someone who seriously helps them out on defense, particularly as someone who can guard out on the perimeter and also is big enough to handle guys inside. He, as a pass first kind of player, is someone who, can get shots for Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, who's not going to be like, okay, I need to take the ball for 25, 30 shots every game, right? He's someone who can kick it out and distribute. Seth Curry and Joe Harris are two of the best 3-point shooters in the league. And with both of them, they're also guys who are underrated on the defensive end and also underrated in terms of, what they bring to the game outside of their 3-point shooting. And Nick Claxton is someone who I've really believed in for a very long time as someone who's, has one of the best profiles as a switching defensive center of, any young prospect in the NBA. He's someone who in theory could be, an exceptional complement to Ben Simmons, as like their defensive stalwarts. And, as you said, that's a team that if everybody is out there on the court and playing and cooperating with each other, they could be the number 1 seed, but just just hasn't worked out for the Nets, unfortunately, in any sort of real way since, they sort of got the draw of Kevin Durant actually coming to Brooklyn.
Yeah. Now, last question from me, Nick, is last big name out there, kind of seeing what's going to play out with him is Donovan Mitchell, Spider, out in Utah. I know Steve and I have already discussed the craziness of Danny Ainge and his wheeling and dealing. How do you think it's going to play out with Donovan Mitchell?
I think that Donovan Mitchell is a lot more likely to be moved than Kevin Durant at this point, because I think that, not to bring the Knicks back into the fold here, but, with the Knicks and the Miami Heat as well, I think those are two teams that they don't quite have the parts to put together a Kevin Durant trade, but if they can't quite get to a Kevin Durant trade, they can maybe get to a Donovan Mitchell trade. And, I think that given that Utah has shown that they're willing to move their star guy, given that they just moved Rudy Gobert, but given also that, it took 4 first-round picks to move Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell is a younger player, you could argue about how much better he is as a fit for New York or for Miami than Rudy Gobert would have been. But ultimately, I think given that Danny Ainge got 4 first-round picks for Rudy Gobert, he's not going to say, you know what, I did great on that first deal. I'm not going to try as hard on the second deal. Just, whatever you can get for Donovan, that's probably fine. He's definitely going to try and move the market as much as he can. And ultimately, if Kevin Durant trades are looking more and more like an impossibility for NBA teams, I am sure that, the Knicks are the most obvious one, but, Miami as well, there could be other teams as well who look at the situation and are like, you know what, maybe it's worth it for us to try and put together a package for Donovan Mitchell. And certainly there are more teams that could compete in the Donovan Mitchell sweepstakes in terms of having the right kind of assets than there are teams that could put together a package for Kevin Durant. So I think there's a decent chance that Donovan Mitchell moves in the next couple of weeks or the next month or so. And I think that the Knicks are in the kind of place where they might be the team that I see as the most likely to make a move for him, not just because, New York native Donovan Mitchell and all of that sort of thing, which, as someone who grew up in New York, I get that that's what the New York media is going to highlight anytime any of these comes up. It's like, hey, we could make the Donovan Mitchell trade. It's like, well, are you sure that's the best thing? But I think the Knicks are close enough in that they're a team that has been in the playoffs recently, but also really needs a primary offensive engine that they can say, you know what, I hate to do this, but, Quentin Grimes and 3 first-round picks and a future swap and maybe a couple other things, is that going to be enough to move the needle for Utah? It won't be enough to move the needle for the Nets for Kevin Durant, but do the Knicks want to make that kind of move for Donovan Mitchell? And again, I'm just spitballing, throwing random assets together off the top of my head right now. But, in terms of that sort of thing, I think the Knicks make a lot more sense as a trade destination for Donovan Mitchell than a lot of other places, just in terms of what they need and how close they are to, being more of a solidified playoff team. Whereas with Miami, do they really want to blow up the team that was the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference last year and take a chance on Donovan Mitchell? Maybe, but I think it's more likely that the Knicks are going to take that risk than a lot of other teams that might be able to put together enough pieces to get Donovan Mitchell.
Steve, do you want to get your thoughts on if Donovan Mitchell becomes a Knick before it happens?
I don't see, and I know it's, again, probably biased. I just don't understand how some people think that, and I'm not saying Nick did by any means, that the Knicks don't have any leverage in the situation. Because with Danny Ainge, I understand that he's done these pull-offs before. That's probably what he's known best for, in fact, besides his playing career. But if you're the Jazz and you choose to wait, to hold out, then you risk the possibility of Donovan being a part of a pretty bad team. And does he want to be part of the get weak for Wembanyama sweepstakes? Like, I don't see him wanting to do that as a competitor and as a New York guy. Because then I think you encroach on him demanding a trade, which, kudos to him for not doing that, because that's what every other NBA star. So I feel like the Knicks have a little more pull in the situation than people think. And I also would just say that Leon Rose, Steve Mills, they're not, Isaiah Thomas. They're not James Dolan and Phil Jackson. So I think that we could just relax a little bit and just let it come to us for once.
Yeah, the Kings having a good GM for the first time in 15 years, I feel very strongly in the same camp. It's like every single terrible trade idea, it's like, well, would the Kings do it? It's like, well, I mean, I don't think so. I hope not.
Right.
But
yeah.
no, I mean, I wasn't saying that to say like, oh, the Knicks are going to make this trade because lol Knicks. I was more saying that because I think that of the teams that I've heard rumblings around Donovan Mitchell, it makes more sense for them than it does for some other teams. But, they're not completely out of leverage by any way, shape, or form. I mean, really, I think Utah is kind of more under the gun at this point because they need to, if they want to continue moving in the direction that clearly everything they've done this offseason signals they're moving in that direction, then they need to trade Donovan Mitchell sooner rather than later. So, it'll be interesting to see how that ends up. But, of those three guys that we talked about between Durant, Irving, and Donovan Mitchell, I certainly think Mitchell is the most likely of those guys at this point to end up actually getting traded.
Nick, it's just nice not having another Celtics guy on the podcast for once. That's what like.
Yeah, it's a little. I'm a big Celtics guy, Nick. I'm from Boston, so I didn't let it shine through too much. There's not much to talk about with the Celtics and the draft or anything right now. So maybe down the road we'll get to the Celtics. But
did you watch the ESPYs last night? I'm sure that was a great moment for all Celtics fans hearing Steph Curry.
Steph Curry is slowly becoming such an enemy of mine. Like I just saw the clip on Twitter. I don't bother watching the ESPYs because it's just nonsense. But I saw him saying that he's the Celtics daddy, and I just don't appreciate that at all.
And Draymond saying the cringiest joke of all time about the Clippers made me click off the TV.
So, all right, fellas. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nick. Why don't you tell everyone where they can check you out and follow all your stuff?
Absolutely. So No Ceilings NBA, as you mentioned up top, I am the editor-in-chief. I write there. No Ceilings, we do a bunch of content. So not just the written stuff on the website, which is noceilingsnba.com. You can also find us on YouTube. We're No Ceilings TV on YouTube. And the rest of the No Ceilings crew, I'm not a social media manager, but the rest of the No Ceilings crew does an awesome job with socials. So you can find them on Twitter at No Ceilings NBA, Instagram, No Ceilings NBA, all that good stuff. You can find me on Twitter at NBAJOHNSON, and all of my work, be it podcasting, be it written work, be it anything else, it will go up on my Twitter page at some point. So if you want to follow along with my work, that's the best place to check me out. And then #basketball.com. And Joey, who runs #basketball, has also expanded out into other fantasy sports markets. So #football, #baseball, #hockey, all coming around in the next few weeks or so. So definitely check that out. And then the NBA Deep Dives podcast, which I co-host with Tyler Metcalf, who is my No Ceilings NBA and my #basketball colleague. So we just wrapped up season 6 of the NBA Deep Dives podcast, and we'll be coming back for season 7 at some point soon. And then, Nets Republic, netsrepublic.com, and at Nets Republic on Twitter, Instagram, all the other socials.
Man, you are a busy man, sir. I respect the hustle. I respect the hustle for sure. And then huge news to Twitter. I'm sure, I don't know if you saw this, Nick, but Steve joined Twitter finally. He was a big Instagram guy, so make sure you go follow Steve on Twitter at _theaverageFan. So if you want to check out all of Steve's opinions, I know he's getting hot on Twitter right now. Love it.
There we go.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time again tonight, and we'll catch up down the road.
Thanks, Nick.